1876. 16-year-old Joseph Plum Martin still hadn't made up his mind. Was today the day he would enlist in the Continental Army? I thought I was as warm a patriot as the best of them, Martin said. On the other hand, he wasn't exactly sure he was ready to risk getting shot. I felt myself to be a real coward, he admitted. Expect a bloody summer. Joseph Plum Martin walked up to the table where a Continental Army officer was seated. A bunch of Martin's friends were standing around the table trying to get their courage up. Come, if you will enlist, I will, said one friend to another. You have long been talking about it, was the reply. Come, now is the time. Martin sat down at the table. The officer handed him enlistment papers and a pen. Martin dipped the pen in ink. He continued going back and forth in his mind, and then he signed his name. Martin left his home in Connecticut and sailed to New York City to join George Washington's army. He began exercising and training, and he began eating army food. The flour and water biscuits were especially bad. They were hard enough to break the teeth of a rat, Martin remembered. Meanwhile, George Washington had troubles of his own. Washington had about 19,000 soldiers in New York. Most of them were like young Joseph, willing to fight but totally inexperienced in battle. The British, on the other hand, had 32,000 well-trained troops. That included about 8,000 of those rented Germans who were famously fierce fighters. Washington knew he was in trouble. We expect a very bloody summer at New York, he wrote to his brother. The general strapped 2 pistols to his belt and warned his men to stay ready. I will not ask any men to go further than I do, he told them. I will fight so long as I have a leg or an arm. The soldiers slept in their uniforms, guns by their side. The British are coming. The British attack came on August 22nd, a beautiful summer day in New York. Thousands of British and German soldiers poured off their boats and started marching toward the American forts of Long Island. On their way to the battle, British soldiers passed rows of apple trees, the branches bending with ripe red fruit. This was too tempting a sight for guys who had been stuck aboard a ship for months, eating salty, rotting ship food. So they stopped to pick and eat apples. Then they got right back to the attack. Soon the soldiers approached the small village of Flatbush, and as you might expect, the people of Flatbush began to panic. Women and children were running hither and thither, said a 16-year-old girl named Femicia. Men on horseback were riding about in all directions. Femicia looked down the street and saw the door of the red schoolhouse fly open. The boys rushed out with a shout, she said. No more school today. Then Femicia helped her mother and sister load everything they could carry into a wagon. My sister and I were all excitement, rushing wildly about the house and bringing the most useless things to put in their wagon. Mother coolly took out whatever did not seem to her necessary. The family rode to stay with relatives farther from the fighting. They came back to their village a few days later to inspect the damage. 2 of our neighbors' houses, as well as our own, were burned to the ground, Femicia said. A midnight escape. The battle was a disaster for the Continental Army, too. In a week of fighting on Long Island, more than 1,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. And Washington's army was driven back and back and back until it was right up against the edge of the 1-mile-wide East River. Washington faced an ugly truth. His entire army was about to be captured right there. Not exactly the way he was hoping the American Revolution would end. But could he slip out of the trap before it shut? On August 29th, Joseph Plum Martin found out the army was moving when he saw the other soldiers of his company lining up and preparing to march. No one could tell him where they were going. First of all, they didn't know. Second of all, they weren't allowed to talk. We were strictly enjoined, ordered not to speak or even cough, Martin said. All orders were given from officer to officer and communicated to the men in whispers. As soon as it was dark, the men started crowding onto small boats. A group of Massachusetts fishermen under the command of John Glover rowed the boats back and forth across the river. Glover's regiment, by the way, was one of the first to include black and white soldiers working side by side. To make the British believe that nothing special was happening, some American troops had to stay behind until the last second. They kept lots of campfires burning, which made it look like a normal night in the American camp. An officer named Benjamin Tallmadge remembered waiting all night for orders to march down to the river. It was one of the most anxious, busy nights I could ever recollect, he said, and being the third in which hardly any of us closed our eyes to sleep. Glover and his men were still rowing back and forth across the river when the sun came up. Amazingly, fog saved them. A thick, wet fog settled over the river, and the entire army, including horses, escaped to Manhattan before the British knew what was going on. In the history of warfare, I do not recollect a more fortunate retreat, said Tall Madge. Too bad you can't win wars by retreating. The story of Nathan Hale. The American army had escaped to Manhattan, but George Washington hardly felt safe. He knew the British would continue their attack very soon, but where, when, with how many men? Washington was desperate for any information about British plans. He needed a spy. Nathan Hale volunteered. Nathan Hale was a 22-year-old teacher who had no idea how to be a spy. One of Hale's friends from college, William Hull, tried to talk Hale out of accepting this dangerous mission. But Hale couldn't be budged. He said he had been in the army for a whole year and hadn't done anything yet. I wish to be useful, he told his friend. So Hale put on the plain brown suit, stuck his college diploma in his pocket, and entered British-controlled territory, pretending to be a teacher in search of a job. No one knows exactly what Hale did or where he went for the next 9 days, but on the night of September 21st, some British soldiers became suspicious of Hale. They grabbed him and searched him and found more than just a college diploma. They found a map he had drawn and notes of the strength and location of the British army. A more experienced spy would have at least used invisible ink or secret codes. Hale didn't even try denying that he was a spy, and the British didn't even bother giving him a trial. They hanged him the next morning. When they put the rope around his neck, did Nathan Hale really say the famous line, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country"? Yes, he did, according to Hale's friend William Hull. Hull wasn't at the hanging, of course, but he got the story from a British officer who watched the execution. And that's pretty much all we know about Nathan Hale. More bad news. Meanwhile, the Continental Army was busy moving backward again. As one of the soldiers in charge of guarding the shore of Manhattan, Joseph Plum Martin kept a watch on the water. Every few minutes, he and the other American guards called to each other, "All is well." But the enemy's ships were so close, British soldiers could hear the Americans talking. And when they heard the Americans say, "All is well," they called back, "We will alter your tune before tomorrow night." They kept their promise. The British attacked again on September 15th, and again the untrained Americans were forced to retreat. In the panic and confusion, Martin got separated from his unit. He was soon sprinting across the island of Manhattan, with the British army close behind. He dove into a swamp and hid behind bushes and weeds while the British marched past. Several of the British came so near to me that I could see the buttons of their clothes. They, however, soon withdrew and left the coast clear for me again. Washington stood on the battlefield, watching his soldiers run for their lives. He screamed for the men to stop. He even hit a few of them as they passed, but the soldiers were simply too scared to stop running. An American officer named George Whedon witnessed Washington's fury on this day. "The general," Whedon said, 3 times dashed his hat on the ground and at last exclaimed, "Good God, have I got such troops as those?" Other witnesses heard Washington shouting, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" Washington was so angry, his officers had to pull him out of the battlefield to keep him from getting captured. Is this the end? The Continental Army continued fighting and retreating through October and November. The British chased them out of New York City, across the Hudson River, and south into New Jersey. "As we go forward into the country, the rebels fly before us," said British Captain William Bamford. "'Tis almost impossible to catch them." Things were looking terrible for Washington's army, what was left of it, that is. Soldiers were deserting every day. "Great numbers of them have gone off, some instances almost my whole regiments," Washington reported to Congress. To make things worse, men were taking Continental Army guns and ammunition home with them. One guy even tried to take home a cannonball. When it was found in his bag, he had an excuse ready. He wanted to give it to his mother, he said. She could use it to pound spices. By the end of November, Washington had just 3,000 men left. This little army crossed the Delaware River and set up camp in Pennsylvania. Washington sent Congress an update saying, "The situation of our affairs is critical and truly alarming." Congress agreed. With the British moving closer and closer to Philadelphia, the members of Congress decided to pack up and run away to Baltimore. What else could go wrong? Oh, plenty. Cold weather was coming, and the soldiers had no winter clothing, and there was never enough to eat. Joseph Plum Martin remembered the men in his unit going without food for 2 full days. When they complained of hunger or pains, an angry officer reached into his pockets and pulled out a piece of dried corn that was burnt to a black crisp and said, "Here, eat this and learn to be a soldier." Now for the worst part. Washington's small army was about to get even smaller. Most of the soldiers had enlisted in the army only until the end of the year. Then they expected to go home for the winter. Martin's enlistment ended in December, and he eagerly traveled home to his family and friends. "They appeared to be glad to see me," he said, "and I am sure I was really glad to see them." Don't worry, Martin will be back in the army the next year. But Washington couldn't wait until the next year. 10 more days, we will put an end to the existence of our army, he wrote on December 20th. Washington had 10 days to save the revolution.